In this video, I'm going to talk about the flatMap operator. Swift Combine has so many operators that help you transform data from one type to another or help you process the input data before it gets to the subscribers. So we have the flatMap operator wherein it will help you transform your input and then output as a publisher. The best way to learn a new concept is through an example. So we're going to create an application where we will fetch some blog posts from a remote server, and then we will convert the data into a post object. So what we will do first is create a post query, and then we will use flatMap to transform that query into a data task publisher, and then at a later time use that publisher to fetch the data and transform that data to the post object. So I already have the blog post publisher here wherein we will be using this to access or use flatMap to convert the post query and create our data task publisher. And then I also have the cancelable and cancelables variable, which will be storing the any cancelable object that are normally returned by subscriptions. So our remote data is a JSON object, which is made of a user ID, title, and body. And this JSON object will be transformed into an object at a later time. So we're fetching it from this server, and our query, we will be using the post query for our query, and then we'll be passing in the ID since we are filtering the blog post using that ID. And then eventually, as soon as we already have the data, then we will be transforming it into a post object. Our post object, it has an ID, a title, and a body. To be able to conveniently transform the JSON data to your object, you just need to use the decodable protocol. So in this example, I'm using decodable, and then I've created the post struct so that the JSON decoder at the later time that we're going to create will be able to use this and then create the objects for us. So I'm going to head over to the view did load, and first the first thing that I want to do is use the blog publisher and then create our data task publisher. What we're going to do is use the blog publisher and then use the post query as our input value and transform it into a data task publisher. So first I'm going to reference the blog publisher and then use the flatMap operator. I'll choose the third option, and the max publishers indicates how many subscriptions we will allow. By default is it set to unlimited, and then within the block we will be also setting and creating our data task publisher. So first I need to indicate the number of publishers that we will allow. At the moment we will allow unlimited, and then I'm just going to label this as query, and then in the body it is where we are going to create the URL session. So I'm going to refer to the URL session and use the shared instance and call the data task publisher, and we need to pass a URL. So first I'm going to create the URL variable and then create a URL object and pass in a string. I'm going to copy the URL here and then paste it here as a string. Okay, so URLs normally would return an optional value. So since we're sure that this is a valid URL, I'm going to unwrap it and then use this here. Okay, so now that we have our data task publisher, all we need to do is return it. And currently we have an error because we need to indicate what is our output type. Since we have created a data task publisher, then we just need to indicate that it is a data task publisher. Okay, so our flatMap operator is complete, and then it's returning now a data task publisher. The next thing that I want to do is print out the result. So I'm just going to use the sync operator, which will receive the output value. And using the sync operator in this case, we need to handle the error and the completion of this data task. And then we also need to handle the output of the sync subscription. So I'm going to name this completion. Completion is an enum wherein it has result, a finish, and then a failure result state. So in order for us to be able to check for either of the states, we will just use a switch statement, and I'm going to use the completion, and then we'll filter for the finish case, and then I'm just going to print finish for this case. And then if it's a failure, then we will just print the error. A failure will actually return the error for us. So we'll just set the error, and then we will print that error in case that happens. Okay, so the next thing is we need to handle the output, and I'm going to just name this output. So an output is a tuple. It has the first value is data, and then the next value is a URL result. So I'm just going to print everything, which is the output tuple. Okay, so the sync subscription is complaining because we need to reference the any cancelable object that this subscription has created. So I can just store it in an any cancelable like this, or I can either set the return value to our cancelable property like this. Now the next thing that I want to do is use the blog publisher, and then we need to send our post query. So I'm going to use the blog publisher, and then since it's a pass-through subject, we are able to use the send method to pass values. And it requires the post query, and then we're going to pass our post ID. So we have created our post query, and we passed in our post ID value, and then this query will be used by our flatMap to create the data task publisher. But then this data task won't be able to do the query because it doesn't have the ID of our query. So I'm going to use the query and then just append it in our URL. Now I have the query object. I'm just going to grab the ID. So as soon as the data task or the URL is created, it already now has the ID, and it will be able to fetch a specific post from the remote server. And I think now we can run this. Okay, right now we were able to connect to the remote server, and it returned the result. And the next thing that I would want to do is be able to print out the post that we have retrieved from the remote server. What I want to do next is transform the response data into our post object. So I'll head over to our code, and then I'm just going to move the sync subscription because we're going to use that at a later time. And I'm going to return this, as another publisher, and I'm going to use the erase to any publisher, which will return the instance of a DataTaskPublisher, and we're going to set this to another variable, and I'm going to call this publisher. So now we have a publisher that we could use and subscribe to, so that we could receive query results from the remote server. And here I'm going to use it, and then the next thing that I would want to do is grab the data from the output. So the output from the data task publisher is a tuple, so we just need to reach in and grab the data. Okay, before I can do that, I have to use the map operator. So map operators will help you transform the input data to a different type, and then you can access the output using a shorthand argument name, which is using the $0. $0 refers to the position of the argument that's available. Since we only have one argument, so we're using $0. If we have a couple of arguments, then if you want to access the second argument, then you would be using $1. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we're going to grab the data. Alright, so map operators will give you the input data and then allows you to return it. So in our publisher, we are grabbing the output, and then now we're returning the data. The next thing that we need to do is transform this data into a post object. And there's another operator that we could use, which is the decoder. So with the decoder, we just need to provide the type that we want to use for the decoding, and then we already have the post, and then we are going to create a JSON decoder object, which will help us with the processing of the result. Okay, so since we have a new subscription, it's asking us to use or reference the any cancelable that it returns. I'm just going to call the store method so that we could store the any cancelable object. Okay, so what's going to happen now is when we're using the new publisher and then we're using the map operator, we're transforming the output of the data task publisher, and then we are grabbing the data and then converting it into a post object. I think we can go ahead and run the app and then see the result of the query. Okay, now our subscription is returning as the post object as opposed to the result earlier. So right now we have our post object, and then with an ID of 1 with the title and the body. So if I want to do another query, I'm just going to duplicate this and then pass in a different ID and then run the app. And then our flatMap operator is set to unlimited. Then it means that we will be able to see a couple of posts displayed in the debugger. Alright, so now we have a couple of posts printed. It means that we have a couple of subscriptions that were made, and then a server request has been made for these subscriptions. If I'm going to change the max publisher count to a maximum number of 1, the result should be different. As I mentioned earlier, max publishers determines how many subscriptions it will allow. And in our example, we have a couple of subscriptions. But in this case, it will only allow one, since we have set only one subscription, even though we have set or sent a couple of queries in our publisher. So to summarize, what we did is we have a publisher and then we use a flatMap operator to transform our query object into a publisher. And then we also have used the map operator to transform the result data and transform it into a post object using the JSON decoder. So if ever you're in need of an operator wherein it will help you to transform an object to a publisher, then you may want to use the flatMap operator.